Secretary of Defense calls a female soldier useless. Then she slips him a note that stops him cold. In a grand military dining hall, under glowing chandeliers and the watchful eyes of decorated officers, power seemed absolute. The Secretary of Defense sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding silence, his words shaping obedience. But that night, arrogance would meet its match. Across the room stood a young soldier, Elena Ramirez, quiet, invisible to most, yet carrying a truth that could shatter the man who ruled the room. With one word, useless. He humiliated her in front of them all, confident that her silence was guaranteed. He could not imagine that within her hand lay a single note that would unravel everything he believed untouchable. Before we continue, if stories of courage, justice, and unexpected reversals inspire you, make sure to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this one to life. What began as an ordinary dinner, filled with wine and laughter, would soon transform into a battlefield of silence and truth. And as Elena stepped forward, the hall would witness something no command, no rank, and no fear could suppress. The night was about to change forever. The dining hall glowed with polished silver and the soft murmur of officers seated in neat rows. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved between tables, serving wine and steak, but all eyes kept drifting toward the long head table where Secretary of Defense Victor Harrington sat like a king at court. His shoulders were squared, his voice carried without effort, and every gesture reinforced the truth everyone already knew. He was the most powerful man in the room. Yet in the shadows, posted by the side wall, stood a young soldier almost invisible to the gathering, Elena Ramirez. Her hands rested stiffly behind her back, eyes sharp despite her stillness, as though she carried a weight no one else dared to notice. Victor lifted his glass, cutting through the noise with a single look. Conversations halted instantly, the air tightening with his silent command. He smiled thinly, pleased at how easily control bent to his presence. Discipline, he declared, tapping the table. Without it, there is no order. Without order, chaos. His words landed like iron on the polished floor, unquestioned, unchallenged. Elena's gaze flickered as if each syllable pressed against her chest. Around her, officers nodded obediently, their expressions carved from stone. Yet her jaw clenched with the tiniest resistance, so subtle no one else noticed. She had heard speeches like this before, but tonight something about his tone carried a darker edge, almost mocking. The first plates arrived, juicy steaks resting on porcelain under warm light. Victor leaned back, letting his aides arrange the dish before him, as if even lifting a fork was beneath his status. He glanced at Elena without a hint of acknowledgement, as though she were furniture, not flesh. His smirk deepened when she instinctively straightened at his gaze. Then, without hesitation, he uttered the word that made the room flinch. Useless. It rolled from his tongue lazily, cutting sharper than any blade, directed at her in front of everyone. Some officers exchanged nervous looks, others stifled chuckles. Elena did not move, but storm began to churn behind her steady eyes. For a moment, the humiliation hung in the air like smoke. Victor returned his steak, satisfied, while murmurs trickled down the table. It was a kind of dismissal that broke spirits, public, deliberate, and cruel. Elena's chest rose slowly as she fought the burn in her throat. She knew better than to respond. Discipline demanded silence. Yet deep inside, the insult ignited something heavier than shame. It was a memory of orders twisted, of lives risked, of truths hidden in sealed files. Her breath steadied. Her hands behind her back curled tightly around a folded piece of paper she had carried all evening, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. At the far end of the hall, Colonel O'Connor laughed a little too loudly, eager to echo Victor's dominance. "Discipline, indeed," he said, raising his glass, pretending not to notice Elena's presence. His laughter bounced across the hall, a signal for others to relax and follow the secretary's tone. Yet the laughter sounded hollow, forced, almost desperate. Elena caught it and understood what it meant. Fear disguised as loyalty. She knew these men were not blind, only terrified to see. Her heart pounded against a secret folded in her hand. She was terrified, too. But terror had a limit, and hers had already been crossed. The chandelier above trembled slightly as the air vents kicked in, a faint hum filling the silence left behind. Elena shifted her weight, feeling the rough edge of the note press into her palm. The hall smelled of roasted meat and wine, yet beneath it lingered the stench of corruption she could no longer stomach. Her throat tightened, but her eyes grew colder. Every insult, every dismissal, every whisper of injustice she had endured led her to this night. She glanced at Victor again, watching his lips curl around another smug comment, and thought, he believes no one dares to speak. He believes wrong. Victor's voice filled the room again, now directed toward another officer. His laughter rippled, drowning out the unease spreading among those too disciplined to show it. He reveled in the sound of his own authority, blind to the shift that had already begun. Elena took a slow breath. She was no longer listening to him. She was listening to the rhythm of her own heartbeat, steady and deliberate. Each thud echoed like a countdown. She pressed the note tighter, her fingers trembling for just a second before her grip hardened. She was waiting, not for permission, not for courage, but for the perfect fracture in the silence where one gesture could cut deeper than any speech. As the secretary lifted his fork, poised to take his first bite, Elena's eyes narrowed. Around her, the officers leaned in, distracted by his every motion. No one noticed her slight step forward, the shift in her breath, the decision already made. She knew there would be no turning back once the paper left her hand. But the moment of insult, the branding of useless, had burned away her fear. A single thought pulsed in her mind, stronger than doubt. He has no idea what this note holds. The act had not yet begun, but destiny had already taken its seat at the table. The room tried to settle back into rhythm after the insult, but something had shifted in the air. Conversations resumed, though quieter, more cautious. Victor Harrington carved into a steak with exaggerated leisure, every motion dripping with contempt. He did not even glance at Elena again. In his mind, she had already been erased. Yet his dismissal only magnified her presence in silence. Officers whispered nervously, eyes darting to one another, wondering if anyone else had noticed the way her posture hadn't broken. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it carried a tension that unsettled the flow of the evening. Victor leaned toward Colonel O'Connor, smirking as he spoke loudly enough for the hall to hear. "You see, Colonel, this is why standards must never be lowered. Allow weakness in the ranks, and it spreads like disease." The words sliced through the room, heavy with implication. His voice echoed not just as a criticism of Elena, but as a warning to anyone else who might dare to resist him. The colonel nodded too quickly, his laughter brittle, but his eyes betrayed unease. The show of dominance was effective, yet cracks were beginning to appear beneath the surface. Elena's heart thudded against her ribs, but she did not flinch. The note in her hand fell heavier with each word Victor spoke, as if it demanded to be released. She thought of the name scribbled inside, the truth compressed into a single line that could shatter the illusion before her. Fear clawed at her chest, whispering that she would be crushed the moment she acted. But another voice, calmer, steadier, spoke louder. "You are not useless. You carry what they fear most, the truth." Her fingers tightened around the folded paper, her decision inching closer with every heartbeat. A sudden clink of a dropped glass drew attention for a moment, but when the noise faded, all eyes turned back to Victor. He seized the distraction, laughing as though even accidents obeyed his command. His arrogance was intoxicating to those around him. A few chuckled along, eager to stay on his good side. Yet Elena noticed something else, the faint tension in the shoulders of younger officers. Their lips pressed thin. Not everyone was laughing. Not everyone believed. It was a fragile crack, but enough to tell her she was not entirely alone. That knowledge burned like fuel in her chest. Victor raised his glass, toasting himself as much as his hollow words. "Order is power," he declared, his tone booming, "and I am its guardian." The officers clapped, some out of loyalty, others out of fear. But Elena heard only the hypocrisy. She thought of the file she had copied, the evidence of his betrayal. That truth was already alive in her hand, small but lethal. Her breath steadied, and she reminded herself that every empire of arrogance eventually collapses from within. Tonight, the collapse would begin not with an army, but with her. Her eyes swept across the hall, reading the room like a battlefield. Some were allies in waiting, others obstacles, but none could see the storm coming. She shifted slightly, enough to let the paper brush against her palm. The decision to act was no longer a question of courage. It was timing. She had to choose a perfect fracture, the second when silence was most brittle, when his arrogance would be at its peak. Her chest tightened with anticipation. She would not wait much longer. Every insult he threw became a countdown toward his undoing. Victor leaned back in his chair, satisfied, and began recounting a past campaign as though the evening were his stage. He exaggerated victories, erased failures, and laughed at mistakes that had cost lives. The officers forced smiles, but Elena felt her jaw ache from clenching. The note pulsed in her hand like a living thing. Her mind whispered the risk. If you fail, you'll be crushed. If you succeed, you'll change everything. She glanced at Victor one last time, memorizing the smug curve of his lips, and thought, this is the face of a man who believes he cannot fall. As he raised his fork once more, Elena's breathing slowed. Her decision was made. She would act, not tomorrow, not later, but soon, before dessert, before he had another chance to spit out his poison. Her eyes narrowed, steady and unwavering. The hall continued its shallow applause and nervous laughter, but she no longer heard it. All that existed now was the folded paper in her hand, and the moment approaching like a storm on the horizon. And in that silence, only she could feel destiny whispered, it's time. The dinner dragged forward, each tick of the clock tightening Elena's resolve. Victor's laughter echoed like thunder against stone walls, his arrogance filling every corner of the hall. Plates clattered, glasses refilled, but beneath the hum of routine, tension coiled tighter. Elena's breath slowed to match the rhythm of her heart. She felt the folded paper pressing into her palm, like a blade waiting to be unsheathed. Her decision was no longer a question. It was only a matter of when. And when the silence stretched just long enough after one of Victor's boasts, she knew the fracture had come. She stepped forward, the movement so slight at first that no one noticed. Her boots clicked softly against the polished floor, cutting into the murmur of voices. The sound drew a few curious glances, but most ignored her, assuming she was just another shadow fulfilling duty. Victor did not look up. He was too absorbed in his own story, describing how discipline had crushed dissent in the past. Elena's eyes hardened. Tonight, history would not repeat. She clutched the note tighter, each step measured, deliberate, as though she were advancing across enemy ground. The officers closest to her stiffened as they realized her path. Whispers died on their lips, replaced by a tension that spread like wildfire through the hall. Colonel O'Connor's smile faltered, his eyes darting between Victor and Elena with rising panic. She reached the head table, her posture straight, her expression calm yet unyielding. Victor paused mid-sentence, finally noticing the soldier standing at his side. He smirked, assuming she had come to apologize or seek permission. Yes, soldier, he drawled, dripping with mockery. The trap of his arrogance had snapped shut, and he did not even see it. Without a word, Elena extended her hand. The folded note rested between her fingers, plain and unremarkable, yet the air in the hall shifted as though a storm had entered. Gasps rippled across the room. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Victor frowned, irritated at the interruption, and snatched the paper from her hand with a scoff. "Is this all?" he mocked, waving it dismissively. But his tone faltered when he saw Elena's eyes, steady, unwavering, filled with something that unnerved him more than defiance. They were eyes that promised consequence. He unfolded the paper. The silence became unbearable. Every second stretched in as a wire ready to snap. Officers leaned forward unconsciously, straining to catch the first sign of his reaction. Elena stood frozen, her chest steady, her hands now empty yet heavier than ever. Victor's eyes scanned the words, and his smirk wavered. For the first time all evening, the mask cracked. His jaw tightened. His hand trembled ever so slightly. The room felt it instantly. The mighty Secretary of Defense had faltered. Whispers rose like wind before a storm. Victor cleared his throat, trying to mask the crack in his composure. He folded the note quickly, but it was too late. The subtle tremor in his fingers had betrayed him. "Nonsense," he barked, attempting to regain control. Irrelevant nonsense. But the officers were no longer watching his performance. They were watching his fear. Eyes darted between one another, questions forming unspoken. Elena's silence was louder than his denial, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted ever so slightly. Colonel O'Connor leaned forward, desperate to salvage control. "Sir, perhaps," he began, but Victor cut him off sharply. "Enough." His voice carried, but it lacked the iron edge from before. The authority that once silenced the room now sounded brittle, strained. Elena did not move, did not speak. Her stillness was a weapon sharper than any command. The officers waited, their attention fixed on her as much as on him. The note had not been read aloud, yet its power was already reshaping the room. Victor's eyes locked on Elena, his breast shallow, his face pale beneath the warm lights. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper meant only for her. "How did you know?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, exposing the fear he had buried for years. Elena did not answer. She simply held his gaze, calm and unbroken. The silence roared louder than any words. And in that silence, the mighty secretary realized he was no longer untouchable. Victor's fingers clutched the folded note, as though he could crush its meaning by sheer force. His eyes scanned the words again, each line slicing deeper into the armor of arrogance he had worn so comfortably moments before. The hall waited in breathless silence. No one knew what the note contained, but everyone could see what it was doing to him. His lips pressed thin, the blood draining from his face. A man who had commanded nations now looked cornered by a scrap of paper. That image alone sent ripples through the ranks of officers who had once bowed without question. He shoved the note into his jacket, as though hiding it could erase what had just been seen. "A prank!" he barked, though the words landed flat, unconvincing. Murmurs swelled across the hall, like a tide rising against him. For the first time, the secretary's voice did not dominate the room. It was competing with suspicion. Eyes darted, whispers spread. The strongest walls in the military were not concrete or steel, but loyalty and fear. And both were beginning to crumble. Elena remained still, her silence sharper than any accusation. Victor's gaze swept the room, desperate to reclaim ground. He spotted O'Connor, who gave a quick, forced nod, but even his eyes betrayed doubt. "Gentlemen," Victor snapped, raising his voice, "discipline is what separates us from chaos." But the tremor in his tone betrayed him. Discipline, once his greatest weapon, now sounded like a plea. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances. Others avoided his gaze entirely. It was no longer Elena who seemed out of place in the hall. It was him. The silence stretched, unbearable, until finally a young major at the far end whispered too loudly, "What was in the note?" The question cracked the air like lightning, and though no one answered, it had already changed everything. Suspicion now had a voice, and once spoken, it could not be silenced. Victor's jaw tightened, his fists clenching on the table. He wanted to crush the young officer for daring, but punishing him now would only confirm weakness. He was trapped between reaction and restraint, and both choices betrayed him. Elena's steady gaze met his again, calm and deliberate. She didn't move, but her presence pressed on him like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. Victor's mind raced. The note wasn't just dangerous because of what it said. It was dangerous because others knew it existed. Every second he refused to reveal its contents gave it more power, and Elena's silence only sharpened the edge. She didn't need to speak. She had already won the first battle. The hall belonged to her now, not him. In desperation, Victor tried laughter, forcing a chuckle that rang hollow. "You see how easily order falters when you indulge nonsense," he said, but his eyes betrayed panic. His words bounced off walls that no longer echoed loyalty. Officers shifted uncomfortably, no longer applauding, no longer laughing with him. The isolation tightened around his shoulders like a noose. Every man in that hall had seen fear before, but never in the eyes of their secretary. And once seen, it could never be unseen. Colonel O'Connor rose abruptly, attempting to seize control of the narrative. "Gentlemen," he declared, voice steady, We will not dignify this distraction. Focus on the secretary's leadership. But even as he spoke, he faltered. The weight of dozens of stares pressed on him, questioning, doubting. His loyalty chained him to Victor, but chains in a sinking ship drag men down. He sat back down heavily, sweat glistening on his brow. Victor realized with horror that even his most loyal ally could not save him for what the note represented. Victor's breath grew shallow, his eyes darting to Elena one last time. He hated her silence more than any words. In that stillness, she had stripped him bare before his own army. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. The mighty Secretary of Defense, untouchable in every hall of power, now trembled under the gaze of one soldier he called useless. And as his chest heaved with unspoken fear, the officers realized the truth. The note was no prank, no nonsense. It was a weapon, and it had already begun to destroy him. Victor's chest rose and fell. Each breath of battle he could no longer command. His voice, once the hammer of authority, now wavered like glass on the edge of shattering. He slammed his hand against the table, silverware rattling across porcelain. "Enough!" he roared, but the room did not bow as it once had. Instead, the command hung in the air, brittle and hollow. Eyes that once obeyed now studied him with quiet calculation. The word no longer silenced dissent. It invited it. Desperate, he pointed at Elena, his finger trembling though he tried to steady it. "This soldier," he spat, "has defied the chain of command. She will be disciplined." Yet even as he said it, no one moved. Not a single officer rose to enforce his order. The silence was deafening. Victor's throat tightened as he realized the unthinkable. His command had been disobeyed in front of everyone. The very discipline he worshipped had slipped through his hands like sand. Elena remained motionless, unshaken, her stillness a quiet defiance more powerful than shouts. Colonel O'Connor stood halfway, his loyalty dragging him upward, but hesitation kept him frozen. His eyes scanned the room, searching for support, but saw only doubt reflected back. If he moved against Elena, he would stand alone. Slowly, painfully, he lowered himself back into his seat, the sound of his chair scraping the floor echoing like betrayal. Victor's jaw clenched. His most loyal man had abandoned him, not in words, but in action. And sometimes silence screamed louder than defiance. The officers whispered now without restraint, their murmurs like fire spreading through dry grass. Elena's name hissed among them, mixed with fragments of questions. What's in the note? Why is he afraid? Victor's eyes darted wildly, but every attempt to regain control was smothered by the weight of doubt. The note had become a symbol, its silence more dangerous than revelation. Elena's calm posture, her unwavering stare, told the hall all they needed. She knew something he feared, and if he feared it, they had reason to as well. Victor lunged suddenly, slamming his palm onto the table again. "Read it then," he snarled, though his voice cracked under the demand. Gasps swept through the hall, but Elena did not flinch. She didn't reach for the paper, didn't move to expose him. She only shook her head slowly, letting his own desperation unravel him further. Refusing to read was worse than reading. It left the officers dangling in suspense, their imaginations filling the silence with corruption and betrayal far darker than anything spoken aloud. The young major who had first asked about the note rose slightly from his chair, his voice shaking but firm. "Sir, if it's nothing, why won't you read it?" The question pierced Victor's composure like a blade. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His silence was the loudest admission of guilt. The hall trembled with the shift. Men who had entered loyal were now staring at him like a man already fallen. The Secretary of Defense had become the accused. Victor's glare turned to Elena, his eyes burning with fury and fear. He leaned forward, his whisper harsh and broken. "You'll regret this," he hissed. But the threat rang hollow, a shadow of power that no longer existed. Elena's gaze did not waver. Her silence told him in the room that she already knew the truth. His power had ended the moment he spoke the word useless. The note was not just paper. It was a mirror that showed the monster beneath his mask, and everyone had seen the reflection. By now, The hall no longer looked to Victor for direction. Their eyes, one by one, turned to Elena. She had not spoken a single word, yet she had become the center of gravity. Officers shifted their loyalties silently, their posture betraying the truth Victor could not escape. Authority had changed hands. The man who had commanded armies was undone not by war, not by force, but by the quiet defiance of a soldier he had dismissed as nothing. And as he trembled in his seat, the inevitable end drew near. The hall felt colder now, the warm glow of chandeliers unable to soften the chill that had settled. Victor sat rigid, the air around him heavy with defeat. His authority had slipped through his grasp, not with a roar but with a whisper. The officers watched in silence, their discipline intact, but their loyalties shattered. Every man present had witnessed the unthinkable. The Secretary of Defense, a figure who once commanded with absolute certainty, now trembling before a soldier he had called useless. The weight of that reversal hung in the air like judgment itself. Victor tried once more to speak, his lips parting, but no sound came. The words that had once shaped armies abandoned him. All that remained was a shallow rasp of a man exposed. His eyes darted, pleading for support, but found none. Even O'Connor kept his gaze fixed on the table, unwilling to share in his downfall. The silence was merciless. It pressed against Victor until sweat traced his temples, and the mighty secretary looked smaller than he ever had in his life. His kingdom had collapsed without a single shot fired. Elena remained unmoving, her back straight, her gaze firm. She had not uttered a single word since stepping forward, yet she had become the voice of the entire room. Her defiance was quiet but undeniable. She did not need to shout, did not need to explain. The note had already spoken louder than any speech could. Around her, officers shifted, their eyes reflecting not just respect but a dawning realization. She had revealed the weakness of a man they thought untouchable. She had reminded them that truth could still pierce through fear. One by one, the officers rose to their feet, not in salute to Victor, but in acknowledgement of Elena. It was not choreographed, not ordered. It was instinct. The room that once belonged to Victor now answered to her presence. He watched with horror as the tide turned completely, his isolation absolute. He reached for his glass, hoping to mask his tremor with a sip of wine, but his hand shook so violently that the liquid spilled across the table. Gasps echoed, followed by a silence that cut deeper than laughter ever could. Victor's eyes burned with rage, but rage without power is only despair. He slammed the glass down, shards scattering across the polished wood. "You think this changes anything?" he barked, but the emptiness of his threat was obvious. The officers did not flinch. They looked past him, their attention fixed solely on Elena. His fury collapsed under the weight of indifference. For a man who thrived on fear, being ignored was the cruelest punishment. The empire he built on control had crumbled into dust before his eyes. Elena finally moved, her steps measured as she turned away from him. She did not need to speak, did not need to claim victory. Her silence was her triumph. She walked toward the exit with the same calm that had carried her through humiliation, insult, and defiance. Each step echoed to the hall, steady and deliberate, a rhythm of justice that could not be silenced. Victor watched her leave, powerless to stop her, powerless even to lift his head. She had taken nothing from him, only revealed what was already gone. As the doors closed behind her, the hall erupted, not in applause, not in cheers, but in murmurs heavy with revelation. The officers exchanged glances, their discipline shaken by what they had witnessed. They knew the secretary's reign had ended, even if no resignation was spoken that night. The truth had been planted, and it would spread like fire through the ranks. Elena had not just stopped Victor. She had ignited a movement of doubt against blind obedience. Her name would carry further than any order he had ever given. Victor remained at the head table, broken, his reflection distorted in the spilled wine and shattered glass. He had once believed he was invincible, but invincibility had died with a single word: useless. That insult had been his weapon, but it had also been his undoing. In trying to silence her, he had given her the stage. In dismissing her, he had given her power. And as he sat trembling, the lesson hung clear: arrogance blinds, and silence can be the deadliest weapon of all. Elena stepped out into night air, the weight of the hall falling away behind her. The stars above were sharp and cold, but her chest felt lighter. She had not spoken, had not shouted, yet she had changed everything. She was still a soldier, still bound by uniform and duty, but no longer invisible. Her silence had echoed louder than 1,000 voices. And as she walked into the darkness, she carried with her the promise that truth, once revealed, could never be contained again. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment with your thoughts. Every like and share helps us bring more powerful stories like this one to life. Want to go further? Join our channel as a member to support our work and unlock exclusive content. More unforgettable stories are on the way. Don't miss the next revelation that will leave you speechless.